The clapping began before he even finished talking. My older brother stood in the middle of the room, shoulders back, announcing that our parents had decided all 8 family rental houses in Florida would go to him, and the youngest gets nothing. He added like it was a joke. Everyone laughed. A cousin whistled. My mother wiped away a proud tear. My father sat back like the decision was set in stone. I didn't clap. I didn't move. I just watched his fork freeze halfway to his mouth. When the room got quieter, I smiled and said, "Dad, before you all get too comfortable, there's something you don't know. I grew up in a house where everything revolved around one person." My older brother would walk into a room and the whole conversation changed. Chairs turned, faces lit up. Even when we were kids, the pattern was clear. On his birthdays, the table was covered with balloons and thick frosting that held the candles straight. Mine were smaller, quieter, the kind where someone only remembered the cake after the knife was already out. I learned early that attention wasn't shared equally. It went to whoever took up the most space. At school, teachers mixed up our names. They only corrected themselves after he laughed first. He had the easy charm, the loud voice, the kind of personality adults liked without thinking twice. I was the kid who finished work early, waited patiently, kept my hands folded on my desk. When I asked for extra math help, my parents said money was tight, then bought him new sports equipment that same week. I didn't argue. I just did what I always did, swallowed the moment, and moved on. Family gatherings followed the same pattern. My accomplishments got lost between conversations like papers sliding off a table. His stories took center stage, retold like they were turning points for the whole family. When I got a compliment, it usually came with a comparison. They called me responsible, independent, low maintenance, as if those words were supposed to make up for everything else. I learned to exist on the edges, close enough to be counted, far enough to be ignored. When I got accepted into a university out of state on a full scholarship, my father didn't hug me. He didn't say he was proud. He just said, "Well, someone has to leave Florida eventually," like my leaving was convenient instead of an achievement. My mother called it practical. She said this way, I wouldn't be a burden. Meanwhile, my brother stayed home and stepped right into the family's rental business. Like a throne was waiting for him. He got praised for helping, even when helping meant depositing rent checks and calling himself a property manager. I left 2 days after my 22nd birthday. I packed the back seat of my old car and drove north until Tampa disappeared in the rearview mirror. Atlanta felt like breathing fresh air after holding my breath for years. A small apartment, a desk, a job where people actually listened when I spoke. No shadows to compare myself to. For the first time, my life was completely mine. Then my grandmother called. She lived in St. Pete, in a house that smelled like ocean air and old paper. She was the only person in our family who ever looked at me without searching for him over my shoulder. When she asked me to come visit one weekend, I didn't question it. I drove down the long highway and arrived to find her waiting on the screened porch with 2 folders on the table. She didn't waste time. She handed me the first folder: payment records, expense logs, numbers that didn't add up, rent that disappeared, categories labeled repairs with no receipts. 18 months of quiet stealing from the properties she'd spent decades taking care of. I gave him access because he said he wanted to learn, she said, her voice steady. Turns out he learned something else. The second folder was thicker. Inside were documents: a living trust, naming her as trustee and me as the person taking over, along with deeds already prepared to transfer ownership the moment she signed. No speeches, no emotional explanations, just her calm understanding of what needed to happen. We signed everything the following Monday, a notary sitting across from us while the ceiling fan clicked softly above. When it was done, she poured 2 small glasses of bourbon and said, "Now it's finished. Remember, this paper outlasts promises." She made me promise to keep it quiet. I did. That was the day I fully understood the place I had always held in this family and the place she believed I deserved instead. After my grandmother's funeral, the house felt hollow, in a way I hadn't expected. Not just quiet, emptied of the one person who ever saw me without comparison. I planned to drive back to Atlanta the next morning, but my mother called late that night, her voice soft in a way that felt rehearsed. "Stay one more day," she said. "We need to talk about the properties." I knew what that meant. Long before I walked into the dining room, the table was set up like a business meeting. Coffee cups in a row, legal pads lined up, my father at the head like he was running something official. My older brother leaned back in his chair, legs stretched out, tapping a pen against his palm like he already knew how things would go. My mother hovered behind them, fussing with napkins nobody would use. My father pushed a single sheet of paper toward me. "This is just a simple form," he said. "Waiver. Since your brother has been managing everything here in Florida, it only makes sense for him to take full responsibility. This just prevents confusion later. I didn't touch it. Not yet. My mother jumped in quickly, her smile tight. It's nothing personal, sweetheart. You're building a life in Atlanta. He's here. It keeps things peaceful. My brother finally spoke, impatience breaking through the confidence. Come on, just sign it. No lawyers, no drama. Let's keep this simple. The room smelled like lemon cleaner and stale coffee. I lifted the paper with 2 fingers. 8 property addresses listed neatly. A signature line waiting for me to erase myself. No one asked what I thought. No one asked if I wanted anything. They assumed the same thing they always had. That I'd bend, stay quiet, make it easy. I slid the paper back across the table. I'm not signing this. The words didn't rise or fall. They just existed. Heavy enough to change the air. My father's eyebrows shot up. Don't start, he warned, using the tone from when I was a teenager coming home late. My mother's eyes got glassy. My brother scoffed under his breath. But I didn't explain. I didn't defend. I didn't give them anything to push back against. I just stood up, picked up my keys, and said nothing at all. On my way to the door, my brother muttered, "She come around." I almost smiled. They really believed that. I drove back to Atlanta that same night, headlights cutting a narrow path through the dark highway. The air inside the car felt heavier than it should. Like the words I hadn't said were riding in the back seat. When I reached my apartment just after sunrise, the city was still quiet. Only the hum of early traffic drifted up from the street below. I placed my keys on the counter, kicked off my shoes, and walked straight to the small shelf in my living room. The fireproof folder sat exactly where I had left it, top corner, spine facing out, untouched. I pulled it down, feeling the familiar weight in my hands. I set it on the dining table, the same table where I spent nights reviewing contracts and payments for my job. This time I opened it, not as an analyst, but as someone preparing for something far more personal. The trust came first, then the deeds. 8 sets of recorded pages, each with the county seal pressed into the corner. I laid them out one by one, forming a neat grid across the table. The paper felt cool against my fingertips. Organized, final. The room felt still, like it understood what I was about to do. I opened my laptop, started a blank spreadsheet, and began typing. Columns for addresses, columns for signing dates, columns for record numbers, columns for tenant payments, the clean ones, and the ones that didn't match. I wasn't building a case. I wasn't preparing for a fight. I was simply organizing facts in a language I knew better than any conversation my family had ever forced me to sit through. The group chat from home kept lighting up my phone. First messages from my mother, all versions of, "Let's keep the peace." Then a text from my father, "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Then from my brother, "Grow up." I muted the thread and kept working, printing, filing, labeling, sliding each document into a fresh sleeve. I moved in a quiet rhythm, the kind that came naturally when I felt solid ground under my feet again. No shaking, no rushing, just the steady click of keys and the low sound of the printer. Outside, the city brightened. People walked dogs on the sidewalk. Coffee shops opened. Car engines started. Life moved on without knowing that mine was folding into a shape I'd been preparing for 2 years. In the afternoon, I stepped out onto the balcony. The wind carried the faint smell of roasted coffee from the cafe downstairs. The skyline shimmered in the heat, buildings stacked like file cabinets against the blue. I held the railing, watched the city breathe, and let the weight of the morning settle. My grandmother's voice threaded into the quiet, the way memories do when the world slows down. Not emotional, not fragile, just steady like truth, spoken by someone who never had to raise her voice. Paper outlasts promises. I went back inside, pulled my suitcase from the closet, and laid it open on the living room rug. The zipper echoed softly as it stretched across the frame. I placed the deeds inside first, then the trust, then the copies of payments and reports I had printed over the last 2 hours. I added a flash drive with digital scans. Everything aligned, everything exact. The suitcase wasn't full, but it felt complete. I packed clothes. Next, simple, neutral. Nothing that would stand out in a crowded room. Then a pair of low heels, the kind I wore to property visits. Then, my favorite blouse, the one with a crisp collar that always looked clean under a blazer. I zipped the suitcase halfway, leaving a small gap at the top. The sound clicked into the room like a marker in time. Evening settled. The apartment glowed with the soft gold of sunset. I made tea, sat on the sofa, and let the steam warm the space around me. I didn't check my phone. I didn't reread the documents. There was no need. Everything that mattered had already been signed years earlier. Around 10. I stood and pulled the suitcase fully shut. The click echoed louder this time. The next morning, I loaded the suitcase into the trunk of my car. The city was just waking up commuters, hurrying through crosswalks. The skyline washed in pale peach light. I merged onto the highway, heading south. The drive had become muscle memory. mile markers slipping by like quiet reassurances. With every hour I put behind me, the noise from my family felt farther away. Their expectations, their pressure, their belief that silence meant surrender. By early afternoon, palm trees lined the interstate. The air grew warmer, thicker, familiar in the way childhood homes feel familiar even after you've outgrown them. I could almost see my grandmother's porch, hear the creak of her rocking chair, the soft click of her ceiling fan as she signed her name on the deeds I now carried back with me. When I pulled into a gas station on the outskirts of Tampa, I popped the trunk to check the suitcase. It sat where I left it, the handle upright. The documents settled inside like a loaded truth waiting for air. I closed the trunk gently. Back on the road, I rehearsed nothing. I planned no speech, no confrontation. My part was already done. The system would handle the rest. The signatures, the seals, the dates. That was my voice. That was my answer. Late afternoon light burned across the highway as I approached the exit to my family's neighborhood. I slowed, turned down the familiar street, and felt the calm settle over me again. The same calm I'd felt signing the papers with my grandmother 2 years earlier. This time, I wasn't returning to soften anything. I was returning to end it. By the time I reached the house, cars were already lining the street. Relatives I barely recognized stood in groups on the lawn, drinks in hand, talking like the future had already been decided and framed. Through the windows, I could see decorations strung across the living room, banners, flowers, brochures laid out on the table like they belonged to a new empire. My older brother was at the center of it all, laughing too loudly, retelling the same story of stepping up for the family. My parents hovered nearby, nodding proudly, soaking up every compliment like it was meant for them. I walked through the door without announcing myself. The conversation dipped for a second, then carried on, assuming I was simply late to applaud. I set my suitcase beside the couch, upright, visible. A few people glanced at it, then at me, and looked away quickly. My brother tapped his glass again, the same gesture from earlier in the week. The room shifted toward him, voices softening into expectation. I just want to thank everyone, he began, for supporting this next chapter. Mom and Dad trusted me with all 8 of our rentals, and I promise I'll. The rest of his sentence dissolved under a new sound, the soft, steady roll of my suitcase wheels across the hardwood. The room quieted, curiosity replacing celebration. I stopped at the center table, clicked open the latches, and lifted the lid. Inside, the documents sat in perfect order. I placed the first deed on the table, and the second, then the third, 8 in total, each stamped, recorded, signed years ago. Each one a quiet truth waiting to be heard. The trust came last, thick, smooth, unmistakable. I set it on top of the stack. My father stepped forward, his face draining of color. Cheryl, what is this? I didn't look at him. I just shifted slightly, so the family attorney, who had arrived minutes earlier to celebrate, had a clear view. He moved closer, adjusting his glasses, reading the header, the signatures, the dates. These are recorded, he said, his voice flattening into something official. All 8 properties were transferred into a living trust 2 years ago. And he nodded. Toward me is the legal successor. My brother's voice cracked before it rose. What? No, what are you talking about? They were supposed to go to me. The attorney didn't raise his voice. They were no longer your grandmother's to give. They've been under her trust and her chosen successor since the documents were signed and notarized. My brother grabbed one of the deeds, flipping pages like a different ending would appear between them. This is fake. It isn't, the attorney replied. I notarized similar filings for her myself. Everything here is legitimate. A chair creaked. Someone inhaled sharply. Somewhere near the back, a cousin whispered a small, stunned, "Oh." Then from the hallway, a voice I hadn't heard all afternoon. My younger brother stepped forward, the quiet one, the one everyone forgot was in the room. I drove her to the notary, he said softly. She asked me not to tell anyone. She said Cheryl would understand. My mother covered her mouth. My father sank into a chair, like the weight of the last decade had finally settled on his shoulders. My older brother stared at the documents, chest heaving, waiting for someone to rescue him. No one did. The room stayed perfectly still. The only sound was the low hum of the air conditioning as the truth settled over everyone like a closing door. I drove back to Atlanta before sunrise the next morning. The roads were empty, the sky still colorless. The kind of quiet that feels like it belongs to no one. My suitcase sat in the back seat. The documents inside no longer heavy, just settled, like something that had finally returned to where it belonged. When I reached my apartment, the city was waking up. Lights flicked on in high-rise windows. Someone walked a dog across the street. The world kept moving, unaware that mine had just shifted into a simpler shape. I placed the suitcase in the corner, opened it only long enough to take out the fireproof folder. I set it on the highest shelf, where sunlight wouldn't reach, and no one else's hands ever would. The click of the shelf settling felt like quiet punctuation. Later, I stepped onto the balcony with a mug of coffee. Midtown stretched out beneath me. Traffic humming, voices faint, a breeze brushing the edges of the railing. For the first time in a long time, my phone didn't vibrate with demands or guilt or explanations disguised as concern. No messages from my parents, no new group chats, nothing pulling me backward. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. What I felt was space clean unoccupied. Finally mine. I thought of my grandmother then. Not her voice, not her warnings, just the way she looked the day we signed everything. The steadiness in her eyes. The certainty. She hadn't given me a burden. She'd given me permission. Behind me, the apartment stayed still. Morning light drifting across the floorboards. Ahead of me, the city kept unfolding, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to go back. Some truths don't need to be argued. They just settle, the way paper settles into a folder. Quiet, precise, undeniable. I learned that boundaries aren't loud. There. The doors you close without explanation. The signatures you don't announce. The silence you choose, because it finally belongs to you. My family keeps searching for the version of me who bent, who stepped aside, who stayed small. She's gone. What remains is the life I built the moment I stopped waiting for their permission. If stories like this stay with you, stay close. There are more truths worth hearing.